To focus on constraints on cities, they find themselves in the midst of what we could call the intergovernmental pyramid at the bottom below federal government and state governments. They're restricted quite a bit by state constitutions and by state law, which basically allows them to only do the things that the state allows them to do and only to raise the revenues that are allowable under the state constitution and state laws. So unlike the federal government and unlike the state governments, they really are very restricted in the way that they can focus on public policy for their citizens. One of the things we're going to take a look at here is this idea of federalism. So many definitions of federalism. We'll use the one provided by Paul Peterson, since we'll discuss him later. So Peterson describes federalism as a system of government in which powers are divided between higher and lower levels of government in such a way that both levels have a significant amount of separate and autonomous responsibility for the social and economic welfare of those living within their respective jurisdictions. Now, we want to think of these in terms of other possibilities of the way that urban governments or local governments could be structured. So when you have a unitary system of government, what happens is basically local governments are no more than administrators of policies made by the national government. But we see that's not necessarily the case in the United States. While cities are restrained in what they can accomplish given their resources, they are able to come up with policies on their own. They are able to use federal funding and state funding in ways that they feel would maximize the outcomes to members of their area. So it's important to realize that there are a lot of constraints on local governments, but given what they would look like in a unitary system with very little control over how they would spend money or policy, local governments in the United States do have a fair amount of power, and therefore it's important to study them and to try to find out what works and what doesn't work so that those policies can be diffused around various cities. Just to give you an idea here, in 2015, which is the latest data available here from the Urban Institute, what we saw was that about $2.8 trillion was spent by state and local governments in the United States. About 1.3 trillion of that was spent by state governments, and about 1.5 trillion was spent by local governments. That might seem a bit odd that local governments are actually spending more than states, but a lot of money is funneled from the states through to the local governments. So about $500 billion of that 1.5 trillion that local governments are spending actually comes from the state governments. So that's a pretty big pass through to them. Now, as you can see here, these are pretty much the areas in which local governments and state governments spend the most money. And when we're talking about local governments here, we also include things such as municipalities, counties, and we're also talking about school districts. So you can see here that elementary and secondary education is the overwhelmingly largest source of funding provided by local governments, typically by a school district as opposed to a municipality, although it depends, depending on the city that you live in and the size of that city as well. Health and hospitals, highways, roads, police, and public welfare are other big sources of expenditures for local governments as well. So these are the basic areas in which local governments deal, and they get a fair amount of money both from the federal government and from the state governments. We'll talk more about the federal expenditures and pass-throughs to local governments at a different time. Now, one thing that we'd like to do in this module is to attempt to understand who speaks for cities and what cities actually want from other levels of government. Focus primarily here at this point on the federal government. So when we talk about state and local interests at the federal level, one of the things that most people look towards that are involved in scholarship of studying what we call the intergovernmental lobby is what's called the Big Seven of the state and local governments. So you can see those Big Seven organizations here: National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, Council of State Governments, National Association of Counties, National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the International City-County Management Association. These organizations try to work together when they can. Oftentimes, the interest of state governments and local governments is very similar. But there are times in which states and local governments don't have the same priorities, in which case it's very important for local governments to have their own voice. One of the problems with these organizations as well is in order to be able to pass any type of policy platform, they need to have what's considered to be a supermajority of their membership vote on behalf of something. So it's oftentimes very difficult to drill down into specifics as to what they want, because imagine getting a large membership of an organization that's diverse across regional lines, across party lines, and so forth, to be able to agree on specifics. So oftentimes the policy priorities of these organizations is fairly watered down because of these supermajorities. Now, as you can see here, there are 4 of the 7 organizations that are focused on local governments in some form. So National Association of Counties. For the large urban areas, the U.S. Conference of Mayors basically represents the larger cities in the United States. So, for example, Michael Nutter, the former mayor of Philadelphia, was president of that while he was in office. National League of Cities also speaks for larger cities, but more mid-sized cities, and it's less focused in on mayors and oftentimes more on city council members or commissioners, depending on the form or structure of government that people have. And then finally, the International City County Management Association is made up of city managers who are generally considered to be outside of the realm of politics. They're the least political of the 7 organizations. Now, all these organizations exist to have policy priorities and to try to get more money and power out of Washington, but they also exchange ideas and try to form best practices and share ways in which their types of governments might focus on achieving policy successes. Now, one of the kind of the godfather of studying these big 7 organizations was a guy named Donald Hayter. He wrote a book, When Governments Come to Washington. He was the first one to really study how state and local interests came to Washington. He had a number of things that would be of interest of us as we try to kind of tease our way through what the interests of cities are. First of all, he said there's a big problem that state and local governments have that other lobbyists don't have. Unlike, say, for example, let's just see Comcast wants to go to Washington, D.C. to lobby for something. They're going to do something directly related either to the cable industry or media content. They have a specific set of agenda goals that they want to accomplish to make their corporation more profitable. What we see, though, is that with mayors and with governors, is they're not policy specialists, they're policy generalists. They deal with a whole wide range of issues. And not only do they want more money, but they want more control over how to spend that money. And that's generally not something that other lobbyist organizations are interested in. So that's a problem. They don't have a natural constituency. Second of all, as I just mentioned before, in order for them to be able to reach a policy position, they have to reach a consensus. Consensus is always very difficult, and oftentimes some of these organizations just can't even take a position on some issues because they can't reach consensus. Another problem that state and local government interest groups face at the federal level is, given the wide scope of things that the federal government does, oftentimes they are in a reactive state rather than a proactive state, meaning they're just trying to play catch up and just keep up with what's actually happening in Washington, D.C., and stopping bad things from happening to their existing funding. And that doesn't allow them to really spend a lot of time advocating for new policies. They pretty much are just trying to keep the status quo from being upended and to get reauthorizations of public policy. So what are some of the lobbying strategies that Hayter talks about? Well, one of the things is that it's very important when these organizations go to Washington, D.C., let's just say it's the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and they have a position. It's important for the U.S. Conference of Mayors to be able to come up with a public policy and then get their individual mayors to go and talk to their members of Congress. So, for example, Senator Bob Casey would be much more interested in hearing from a mayor of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh than it would hearing somebody from just the U.S. Conference of Mayors that's a lobbyist. Why? Because they're both politicians, they both understand problems, and it's a way to talk about the constituency and how things would affect them. So it's important in a lobbying strategy not to have actual lobbyists lobby members of Congress, but rather have the membership of these organizations go out and lobby them. Second big lobbying strategy is, I mentioned this idea of specialist kind of interest groups, the Comcasts of the world and so forth. So it's important for these big seven organizations to join up with coalitions of other interest groups from the private sector that are trying to get policies passed. Joining together, having a larger kind of ecosystem of organizations that's pushing for something gives them a better chance of being able to survive and get policy passed, because they have much larger networks of membership that are able to press members of the Congress to pass public policies. So those are some of the insights that we see coming from Donald Hayter. Suzanne Farkas wrote a book called Urban Lobbying, Mayors in the Federal Arena. It's fairly old at this point, but it's really the only book-length study that we have of how mayors, particularly from large cities, try to influence the public policy process. Most of her focus was on the U.S. Conference of Mayors, some with the National League of Cities, some other organizations. Basically what she says is, the poverty of municipal governments is the biggest problem that they face. So in other words, again, they are relying on the federal government for funding, they're relying on the state governments for funding, they're relying on those governments not passing unfunded mandates that force local governments to pay for programs that they don't have money for. So all of this is caught up in the problems that urban areas face and municipal governments, is that they have a lot of responsibility, but not necessarily a lot of control over how they can actually function. And Farkas points to a very interesting development at the national level. So particularly starting with the Great Depression, cities went to the federal government with their hands out and asked for money because they didn't have enough money to be able to deal with the services that needed to be provided at that point in time. Went to DC created programs, but in many cases didn't fund those programs fully or gave a lot of strings attached to those public policies so that local governments, for example, had to do what they were kind of go with federal mandates, and at the same time also had to, spend through matching funds. And one of the big problems is that once the urban interest and local government interest started to get these programs passed, it was very important for them to keep the programs going because they didn't have the money to focus on them on their own. So it's a constant situation where local governments are going to the federal government and the states with their hands out. So Farkas talks about three goals of urban lobbying. First and foremost, as you can probably recognize, is the idea of financial gain. They're looking for more money. They don't want to have to spend their own resources and raise their own taxes because that makes them not competitive with other urban areas. Second of all is they want local autonomy to be able to make decisions on their own. So one thing is they don't want the state governments to be involved in public policy programs. They want to make sure that they channel money through the cities directly, not through the state governments, and they want to make sure that they funnel money through the cities and not private or nonprofits. And then